Okay. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Oregon Conservation Partnership webinar. Can everyone hear me? Someone just send me a yes in the questions box. I'm using a different audio system than usual. Okay, great. Thank you, Max. So this OWEB, this presentation from OWEB is on OWEB grants from start to finish. It's part of the monthly Oregon Conservation Partnership series that happens every third Thursday. I'm Anna Freitas. I'm the Policy and Program Manager for the Oregon Association of Conservation Districts, and I'm going to be the monitor, keeping an eye on any questions and making sure things are running smoothly. These webinars are offered with the support of OWEB and the Pacific Corrugated Pipe Company. I'm sorry, I'm trying to share my screen here, and it's not working. Okay. I think you should be able to see my screen now. So those are our sponsors, and we thank them very much for the support and the ability to offer these webinars. We have 26 people registered for the webinar today, and we hope that more people will access it later because the webinar will be recorded and posted on the Oregon Conservation Partnership website under the Webinars tab. In a minute, I'm going to hand it over to our presenters, Katie Duzick and Sue Greer. But first, there are a few little housekeeping items. First, everyone except the panelists, Katie and Sue and myself, are muted by default, but there are a couple of ways you can interact during the webinar. Throughout the presentation, you can type a question into the little questions box, and I will be looking at those and sending them to Katie and Sue and helping them pause at convenient places, hopefully, so they can answer those questions. We're going to try to leave some time at the end of the presentation, too, for you to ask questions, and at that point, you can either type a question, as you have been, or you can raise your little hand by clicking the hand icon, and I will unmute you so you can ask the question yourself. The presentation will be posted on the Conservation Partnership website, as I mentioned. It will be a recording, and there will also be a PowerPoint. Finally, just a reminder that these webinars are for councils, districts, land trusts, and really any partners and conservation advocates and practitioners who find these useful. So feel free to share the links, forward the reminder emails, and share the knowledge. The next webinar is scheduled for August 15th. It will be on 401 water quality certifications for restoration, when you need them, why they're important, and what the process entails. Finally, there is a short survey at the end of this webinar to ask for your feedback. We really appreciate you taking the time to give us feedback so we can continue to improve these, and so you can tell our funders, or so we can tell our vendors how much you value these webinars. You can also suggest future topics for webinars in that survey or just email me. So I think that is everything. If you don't receive the updates already, you can email me to get added to the Oregon Conservation Partnership listserv, so you will receive those webinar reminders. And with that, I will hand it over to Katie. One second while I switch the presenter here. Okay, Katie, you're good to go.
Great, thank you. So I'm Katie Duzick, and I am the Regional Program Representative for OWEB on the North Coast, and with me is my counterpart, Sue Greer, and she is coming to you from the Mid-Columbia region, and we are here today from both sides of the state to help you navigate OWEB a little bit better. And our goal is to help you take a project all the way from an idea through a successful grant application, through project implementation and monitoring and wrap up. And so this webinar is modeled after a presentation we gave at Connect this spring in Sun River. And so we've shortened it quite a bit in the hopes that we can make it fit webinar format based on the request from the Oregon Conservation Partnership. So I hope you enjoy our webinar. Again, please ask questions throughout the process. We're happy to answer things as we go. So our webinar is going to take you, like I said, through our OWEB process, and we're going to start with To Boldly Go, first steps for project development. Then we're going to take you into I Need More Power, a project becomes a grant. And lastly, we're going to close with Live Long and Prosper, wrapping up and monitoring a project. And so this kind of weird and quirky Star Trek theme that you're about to experience was a suggestion of a coworker of ours. And I just have to put the caveat out there is that Sue and I ourselves know nothing about Star Trek, and we will not be accepting any questions about Star Trek during this presentation. So that's the caveat. So to boldly go, first steps for project development. You have an idea for a project. You would like to restore the Starship Enterprise, and OWEB is targeted as your source of funding. So what are we going to need to do to get there and successfully secure a grant? But first, we would like to know a little bit more about you guys and who's participating in this webinar and what your role is within your agencies. So if you could pull up the poll for us, Anna, that would be great.
There you go.
We want to know what your role is within your organization.
Can you see those results?
Yes, we can. It looks like the majority of you guys are project managers. We also have some fiscal staff, which is great, and executive directors and district managers. And of course, as I expected, we have some folks who do it all, which is really a common model for our organizations in our state. So thank you. Anna, can you go to the next question? We'd like to know what kind of befuddles people most about OWEB. Maybe befuddled is a bad word. Confusing. That's the word that I had in mind. Unfortunately, you can't check more than once. Okay. So applications and reporting look like they're the top contenders, but it looks like some of you find a little bit of everything confusing, or at least there's votes for at least all the processes. So, well, maybe fun requests. It's hard for me to see, but I think that we will tailor our discussions appropriately and maybe spend a little more time on applications and reporting. So thank you for that, Anna. If you could return the screen to our presentation, So in this first topic, to boldly go, we are going to cover your strategy when you have an idea for a project, where to take it with OWEB. We're going to talk about developing your budget, and we're going to talk about the OWEB review process. I think we are not covering very much of the actual online application process in this talk. We have other webinars that we've done about that component, so we won't be covering that in great detail, but we are going to talk about what happens when you submit your application and how to make it competitive and help things go smoothly for you. So with that, I'd like to take it to Sue.
Great. Thank you very much, Katie, and welcome to all of you that are listening to the webinar. I hope it's very helpful. So the first topic I'm going to talk about is pre-consults with your OWEB project manager. Before you start developing an application, it is wise to touch base with your RPR or OWEB project manager to determine if the concept is even eligible for OWEB funding. Our eligibility is determined by rule, and you can get that information off of our website. We have both the Oregon revised statutes and the Oregon administrative rules that say what we can fund and what we can't fund as far as project concepts. Secondly is consider on a monitoring grant to talk to your OWEB project manager, and what I like to do in Region 6 is set up a conference call with Ken Fecho, who is OWEB's effectiveness monitoring manager or coordinator, and sit down and talk about the monitoring app before you write the application, just to help flush it out to where it is more competitive and would fit the OWEB monitoring determination. Lastly, think about maybe asking to do a pre-application site visit. A lot of times, especially in the fall cycle, once you submit an application, it's difficult to get to a site. If it's a high elevation, we have mud or snow issues, we can't get to the site. Or conversely, in the spring, by the time we are looking at site visits in June and July, fire danger might be an aspect. We can't drive to it. So talk to your OWEB project manager about the likelihood of doing a pre-app site visit. The side benefit of that is you also will have review team members and OWEB project manager input before you submit the application to get some more detailed information included. Secondly, I'm going to talk about landowner and partner conversations. As you're developing applications, think about the transparency of your project. Talk about what the project components are, what the timing is, what the expectations are, both now and into the future, especially with your landowners. Have them understand who's funding the project and what the expectation of that funder is as well. Make sure they're aware that any state-funded projects are public information. So both reporting, monitoring, and components are all public information if they're funded with state or federal dollars. And then also thirdly, maintenance and expectation that landowners will work into the future to preserve the objectives of the application. So the last one we're talking about on this section will be conceptualization. The big one when you're starting to develop your project and the narratives that go into the online application is why here and why now. Include that information in the narrative. Be able to pass the red face test. Does it provide uplift to existing ecological conditions? And if so, how? Is the timing critical? Are ESA listed species going to disappear if it's not done right now? Is your match funding going away? Include all this information into your application. Make sure you include a pretty comprehensive discussion about alternatives considered, and also why the one solution that you're pushing forward was selected. Talk about permits, what the timing is, what the cost is, informing your landowner about permits, and also include that conversation with partners. there's a possibility maybe they could pick up some of the cost on doing compliance or permitting pursuit. Write like you're explaining the story to a stranger. Don't assume all reviewers and OWEB understand the project. One thing I talk to my grantees about is share your draft for constructive input with your project manager before you submit, with your review team members that you are involved with, or other partners. Maybe even have someone in your family read it, and if they understand it, it's a good idea that maybe you are telling the story with a lot of detail. Be concise, yet provide enough detail to tell the story. Review team members have to read sometimes as many 30, 40, or even 50 applications. Now you can advance the slide, Katie. So this is just one stack from one review cycle, and that's a lot of information. So don't repeat data. Don't repeat the story in several sections. Be concise, but make sure you're telling the story with enough detail that we understand. With that, I'll hand it back over to my coworker, Katie.
Thanks, Sue. And I'm going to talk a little bit about developing your budget for the project and making it translate into our online application. That stack of applications that you just looked at, one thing I just want to point out before I move forward is that when you attach an upload to your online application, so you might be tempted to say, oh, wow, there's this really cool study that was done around this project area. I think I'll attach it as an upload. The reviewers get that assembled into a PDF, and so they will open your application and see that it might be 400 pages long, and that can be a little overwhelming. So we encourage submitting an abstract of the study on one page with a link to how they can access it in the future. Okay, so talking a little bit about budget development, and now I know it looks like the majority of folks on this webinar were project managers, not accountants, although we had some fiscal staff. This budget development is kind of like the quick and dirty budget talk for project managers. We have other fiscal trainings, as you guys know, that get into the details a little bit more, but I just wanted to cover some of the basics because it's kind of hard to translate a bunch of hand waving in the fields or various rough estimates into numbers on a page. And the budget is where kind of the rubber meets the road, so to speak. And a good budget or a bad budget can make or break your project's chance at success. So I'm going to talk about a few tips for developing your mission. When you're designing the project, even though you're a project manager, now you are a fiscal engineer. And so with that comes some fiscal responsibility. You've got to be clear and concise with the budget. So you don't want to leave any room for questions. You shouldn't have a budget that shows up that creates more mystery around it. The budget is where people should be able to look and see what's happening. You want to avoid the dreaded lump sums. Most reviewers hate lump sums as it just creates more questions. If you have a contractor who's providing you with an estimate and they give you a lump sum, give them a follow-up call and see if you can't tease that out a little bit more, at least into deliverables. Get help from others. Past projects that you've worked on, contractors, other organizations doing similar work, all it takes is a quick phone call to find out how much fencing is costing these days. This is the budget categories 101, as now you've got to take your costs and put them into our OWEB budget categories. And again, this is super quick because this we have many other fiscal trainings and our fiscal person travels around the state. But this is kind of the budget category 101 for project managers, and I'm going to cover some of the top mistakes we see that create confusion in your budget. Salaries, wages, and benefits. These are staff from the applicant organization. Don't include anybody else here, just your time and the time of your staff that's working on the project. Contracted services. These is for work done by contractors and also partners. So if OWEB is looking at your designs and coming out in the field with you and providing in-kind in that regard, that goes into contracted services. Travel, the same as salaries, wages, and benefits. That is just for staff from the applicant organization. Materials and supplies. These are things that you are purchasing. If the contractor is purchasing them, then they go up in contracted services. Equipment. Equipment is for things that cost more than $2,500 and have a lifespan of 2 years or more. If it doesn't meet that threshold, it goes into materials and supplies. And the vague other category, items that don't fit anywhere else. And we have a pretty good list of things that should fit in this category available in our budget category document on our website. Post-grant is for things that happen after the grant is closed, such as monitoring. Indirect costs. This is a mysterious category, overhead and admin costs that cannot be readily identified to a specific project. I'm not going to get too into this one. This is where the next thing comes into play. Work with your fiscal staff. Even if you don't have a fiscal person who's on staff full-time with your organization, you probably have a bookkeeper or someone who advises you on these things, and they can help you find the rates that are appropriate to charge for your staff. They can advise about that mysterious category I mentioned of indirect costs, and they can help sort out the questions you might have about categories. And so make sure that your fiscal staff is looking over your budgets before you submit them. That can prevent problems and confusion from happening later. Lots of times we see folks submitting budgets that maybe their fiscal staff didn't have a peek at, and it's really important to involve them when you're trying to put everything on paper here. Thirdly, third tip here, make sure you've adequately budgeted. There's a little thing that's sort of unfortunate about OWEB grants is it's a really great thing, and it's totally fine if you don't spend all the money that you were allocated at an award, but we can't give any more to a project. We cannot add funds to a grant agreement. And I've been seeing in the North Coast folks not having budgeted, and sometimes these things are unexpected and can't be helped. And they have to go back to the drawing board and try and find additional funding to supplement their OWEB grant and the funding they thought they had that was sufficient. So make sure that you've considered the following things on the screen. These are the areas where I see folks often under budgeting. Your project management time. It's easy to skimp on this because you want your project to be competitive, but really think about how much of your time it's going to take. Lots of times I see folks really scrambling or losing money on projects in that category. Travel seems to be something that is either wildly overestimated or wildly underestimated, so give some thought to that. Equipment, permits, and fees. Sometimes these come up at the last minute. If you think you need a development permit, or if you don't even know, but it sounds like it is a remote possibility, you should include the fee in there because those fees can really add up. And I want to talk a little bit about contingency, since this is sort of the cushion for your budget. OWEB does have a contingency policy, and we do allow you to put contingency in your budget. But how this grantee did it, adding in one lump sum construction contingency, $70,000, that doesn't work with our policy. We allow 10% only, and it has to be on a line item like this budget has done. They decided they might go over a little bit with excavated material, so they've added 10% to that one line item on the bottom. And that meets our contingency policy, and you can do that in your budget where it would be appropriate and a good fit. So now we're going to talk about what happens after you submit your application. And considering you've just submitted an application with a rock star budget, you've got a pretty good chance of moving forward in our process. So we're going to talk about our decision pathway and focus in now on that first part, the review team recommendation to staff, which is the first place your application will go once it's submitted. The first thing that will happen if you applied for a restoration or a TA grant at times is the OWEB regional program representatives such as Sue or I and relevant review team members who are interested or and access. So you want to plan for access for your site visit. Is there a lot of walking? Do you need a UTV, a 4x4 pickup? Is there going to be locked gates, snow, muddy roads? Give some thought to that when planning out your site visit with your regional program representative. You'll want to provide some handouts for the team. I think it looks really nice in this region anyway when folks bring a one-page document that shows the highlights of the project and a map on the other side. That's professional and gives the reviewers who are reviewing things often digitally in their office the opportunity to have something in front of them while they're looking at your project. You'll want to bring appropriate partners or contractors and be prepared for technical questions. The review team will ask technical questions on the site visit, so you want to make sure you have the right people at the table to be able to answer those questions. If you don't have answers to the questions, or if that contracting engineer who charges $150 an hour just couldn't make it that day, there'll be an opportunity typically to follow up with the review team after the site visit. So it's not imperative that they're there, but it does make for a nice site visit if the answers can happen in the field. You'll want to give your application the old once-over before you go out to the site visit. You don't want to be surprised by something that you forgot about or didn't notice with the question. And I recommend doing a dry run to determine the route and the time needed to access the site. Sometimes you get a locked gate, which you can't access. That's happened to everybody at some point. And it's never a good thing when the reviewer spent half the day getting out there to encounter an obstacle like this. Are there livestock on the project area? In this case, those cows were really friendly, and the most they did was try and eat paperwork from this review team member here from the BLM. However, sometimes there's bulls in the fields, as you guys know, and you just want to make sure you know where that livestock is and make sure it's safe to access the area. And I throw this one in for us coastal folks. Tides are really important. You don't want to plan a site visit for an estuarine restoration project or a tide gate when the tide is so high that your project site is covered or submerged and looks like a bathtub and you can't see the structure you're talking about. So after the site visit, those review team members who attended the site visit will have some really important details to share with everyone else at the review team meeting. Shown here, actual photo of a review team meeting. No, our review teams actually don't dress like that, and they're made up of relevant agency experts from all around the region. They're folks who know the areas really well. The makeup of our review team is multidisciplinary experts from relevant agencies, and they strive to mimic the makeup of the OWEB board members. So once the review team discusses the project, they will talk a lot about what we call evaluation criteria. Many of you may have seen these diagrams before. This is the criteria for a stakeholder engagement grant offering. And what our review teams will do is focus their discussion around the relevant elements that are in our rules to determine whether or not the project is in that sweet spot, the likelihood for success. Then review team members vote on whether to fund or not fund the project based on how well they met the criteria. If the project is a majority vote yes fund, then it will be a recommended fund, and the review team will then prioritize the project. Prioritization happens based around our evaluation criteria, how well the project meets that criteria. Also, we do have some ranking criteria in our rules, and then they think a lot about ecological benefits. And so all of this conversation and prioritization will be documented in an evaluation that you'll receive. At the end, an opportunity for a conversation with the review teams to provide feedback. And if you have to resubmit your application, you'll be able to have some good comments in which to do so effectively. Now, the review team has made the recommendation to the staff at this review team meeting that we just discussed, and what happens next is the staff needs to make a recommendation to our board. So the unfortunate reality of the situation is every cycle there are more projects recommended for funding than there is money in our spending plan. And this is a good thing. It means there's lots of good work going on, but it's also an unfortunate thing because not every project can be funded, and OWEB staff have to figure out what needs to move forward and what can wait till next time. So OWEB management gets a list of all the projects that were recommended for funding around the state by the review team, and they take a look at our spending plan. The evaluation comments are considered along with the ranking criteria and the rule. The management team looks at how well each project met the criteria, the likelihood for success, the watershed cost and benefit, and they make a final decision for recommendation to our board, which is also known as the famous funding line. And there is not a regional allocation for money around the state, although the management team does endeavor to be somewhat equitable. However, the projects are weighed amongst themselves on a statewide basis when they get to this point. The last part of the process is the board award. So the staff goes to the OWEB board. We tell them the results of the review team meeting. We tell them the staff recommendation, and the board makes the final decision. And the timing of this whole process that we just talked about, from applying to OWEB to receiving the funds at the board award, is 6 months in length. At that point, if you were successful, and for our intents and purposes here, we're going to assume that you were successful, the application will be opened up for changes, and OWEB staff will move forward with the grant agreement. And so before I move on to our next segment, Anna, have there been any questions so far, or does anyone have any burning things they need to know before we talk about grant agreements?
I don't see any questions yet, but if anyone in the audience wants to type in a question, now would be a great time, or you can type it in a little later as things come up, and I will continue monitoring those and find a place to pause.
Great, thank you, Anna. Just let me know if something comes up. Okay. So now we're going to move into the next segment of our presentation. I need more power. A project becomes a grant. And we are going to cover in this section the anatomy of your grant agreement. We're going to talk about submitting a fund request, the various progress reporting that you might need to do, budget amendments, scope of work changes when things might go not as planned, and time extensions. So I'm going to continue with talking about the anatomy of your grant agreement. And now I understand that sometimes when you get your grant agreement on your desk, it's not the most exciting piece of literature you have ever received, and you might be tempted to just take a quick sign and pass it on back, but it is important to get to know your DA. And so just like the anatomy of a ship, your grant agreement also has really important parts that you're going to want to look out for. So the first thing you do when you get a grant agreement, you're going to read your grant agreement. Again, I know this is not the most, exciting thing, and I don't recommend reading it right before bedtime, but it is important to get to know the information. So on the first page of your grant agreement, just right at the top, you're going to get a lot of key information. You're going to know when you have to be done with this project by. In this case, restoring the Starship Enterprise is going to take quite some time. And so you've got, several decades in which to do so, and then you've got to monitor it for 100 years. You want to make sure you understand the reporting period and get a good look at the schedule. The second step, once you get your grant agreement, is to look for the key information. Again, the end date of the project. Does that make sense? Does the end date work for you? As a project manager with OWEB, I usually check in with the grantees before I assign the end date, because I want to make sure that the pipe dreams written in the application are really based in reality, and that some, crazy thing didn't happen between the time of application and grant agreement that might postpone the project. You're also going to want to have a look at your reporting requirements. The grant agreement will have information on landowner agreements, what kind of match is required, the funding source of your project, which is important because different funding sources that OWEB allocates can come with different reporting requirements, and also what's known as special conditions. often found in Exhibit B. Once you've digested all that stuff, you're going to need to sign your grant agreement. And the places to sign and fill out, this is one thing I see a lot of times as I'm copied on emails between OWEB staff and the grantees, is they don't fill out sometimes all the sections, and it goes back and forth involving a bunch of painful scanning and emailing. And if you just sign and fill it out in the places right off the bat, it can save some time and hassle for you. So you want to sign the signature page, seen here. Then you've got to fill out your permits and licenses. Don't forget about this. This is what OWEB staff look to when we see whether or not the project needs permits, and we want to make sure that those are well documented, as this person did here. And you want to look at your insurance requirements. If you don't need additional insurance, like this lucky person, they just checked the box and moved on with their life, and that is the large majority of projects that we see. Send it back to Katie Dunville, who is probably the person who sent it to you in the first place, so you don't need to write down her email because it'll be coming from someone that it should be returned to. And I need to note that, sadly, the grant agreements are not negotiable. The Department of Justice has reviewed and approved our grant agreement language, and so we cannot really negotiate on the terms of that agreement, although we are happy to discuss it and make sure that everyone understands the requirements and what's in the document. Okay, so you've got your project going, you've signed the grant agreement, you're running really, really fast, you need to get paid. You've got a contractor on the line, lots of stuff is happening, so we need to think about a first fund request. And now this is really key because first fund request takes a lot more time than later fund requests, so you want to make sure that you are planning for this. And so there's different requirements with each grant agreement. You want to read your grant agreement again, and I'm sorry if I keep saying that. It seems self-explanatory, but it is important, and allow for extra time to compile your materials. You're going to need to submit your permits with your project if it's a restoration grant. And you can find that information typically in Exhibit E in the grant agreement, and it will talk about the kind of permits you might require. And OWEB is going to need copies of those before we can pay a first fund request. We may be able to release funds from activities that don't require a permit, so it's just really important to communicate with your project manager about this if you think that this might be the case. Landowner agreements. You need to have the landowner on board before you move forward with your project. The requirements for a landowner agreement can be found in our, again, in the grant agreement. We accept any landowner agreements that meet these requirements. It doesn't have to be a special OWEB template. Lots of times the cooperator agreements that organizations already use are fine, as long as they meet these criteria established in our grant agreement. We're also going to see proof of secured match. You can provide this in several ways on our match funding form, which is provided with our application. Make sure that secured box is checked. Lots of times I see this, it's signed, there's a dollar value, everything looks great except the pending box is checked, and our fiscal staff cannot process the request without secured match. So you have to make sure that your match sources are checking the right box. They can also provide an email as long as it states the project name and a dollar amount. We accept grant agreements from other funders too, and we also would accept a written letter, but as long as all of those have a dollar amount. The land use form. This can be varying degrees of difficulty depending on who needs to sign your land use form. In most places, it's the county. You need to take this form to the county or appropriate local official and have them check one of the top two boxes. Either the project is not regulated or it's been reviewed and compatible. If they check one of the other boxes, then we're going to have to do some more digging, and sometimes another permit is required. This form is required with restoration grants. Pre-project photos and maps. We're going to talk about photo monitoring a little later in this, but I just want to mention that Restoration grants with OWEB now all require the pre-project photos and maps to be submitted before you get going. This has really helped with the classic scenario of pre-project photos going missing but when it comes time to do the project wrap-up and completion. So this method has been working really well because now everyone can feel confident that the record of their photos is kept at OWEB. And like any funding request, you've got to submit your expenditure tracking sheet. It serves as a record for all grant expenses. Make sure you're including your indirect costs here. Your fiscal staff or your bookkeeper can help you with this quite a bit. When you're ready to submit, you can email it to your project manager and get the latest form from our website. Easy as can be, right? All right, and now I'm going to turn things over to Sue, who's going to take you through the progress reporting.
Thanks, Katie. So first off, what is a progress report? Progress reports are a required check-in with your OWEB project manager about the status of the project. They aren't required on all grants, but if it's a more complex or if there's some time sensitivity, your OWEB project manager will include that in, as Katie showed on that first page of your grant agreement. It's right under the completion date, and it'll have a date, and then also on Exhibit B, it will talk about what needs to be included in that. What I like to see on progress reports are what's been done on a project, what's left to achieve, what challenges you are facing, and will it still be done on time. You can also check in OGMAS to see under grant detail or reporting detail, it'll have progress reports dates there as well, just to make sure you get it in on time. And the way you deliver it is you send an email to your project manager using identifying in the subject line that it's a progress report, what number progress report it is, and then the grant number. And then the project manager will approve that and send it on so it's a part of the master file in Salem. What if I don't get it done? Go ahead and advance it, Katie. Just like other progress reports, or just like other reports, if they're late, they're going to hold up grant agreements, grant amendments, or reinstatements on any of your other grants. So make sure that you know when they're due and get them in on time. So now we're going to go talk about budget amendments. Back in January 2019, OWEB made a policy change to their budget amendment process that you only need to do a budget amendment when you are shifting 10%, cumulative 10% of the overall OWEB grant award, or if you're adding funds to a budget category that did not contain funds in your application budget. So what's 10% cumulative? Here's an example A where the OWEB grant award was $32,388. And they want to move $4,000 from contracted services to salaries, wages, and benefits. This, go ahead, Katie, will require a budget amendment. The next example is the board award is $149,236, but they want to just move $250 from contracted services to materials and supplies. This will not require a budget amendment. However, you still need to communicate that to your OWEB project manager when you send in that fund request. I would suggest including that in the body of the email, explaining what that little change is. It's just trying to keep that transparency of what's going on with the project. You don't need to do a budget amendment, but you need to keep in communication with your project manager. So this is a budget amendment form. Again, we are saying this over and over, but always download the most recent version from the OWEB website. This is what you would fill out when you have a 10% or more shift from one category or from the OWEB board award. The new form has justification for change questions. What needs to be changed and why is it necessary? How do the changes enhance the original intent of the project? How are you able to accomplish the line items from which funds are being shifted? Be sure to include that when you fill out this form. Now, if it's not 10% or more, you're going to just note it on the fund request form. Go ahead, Katie. You're going to leave the current budget amounts the same in that first column. The way it shows up will be with parentheses for reductions and the changes increasing in the columns. And so that makes it easier for your project manager to determine if it's at that 10% or more. Again, this is going to be gone over in any of Tara Patton's, Tara Choate's fiscal trainings that are coming up. So if you have more questions, we can go into it at a future time. So now we're going to talk about scope of work modifications. Every project has the potential of not going forward exactly as your application determined. You may say you were going to do the USS Enterprise, and then you turn out it's Starship Enterprise. This is probably a scope of work modification that we're not going to accept because you still have to follow the original project objectives for ecological uplift and change to the environment. So it needs to align. So let's talk about some examples of scope of work modifications that would be acceptable. So say you're doing a spring development, and when you go to start implementing the project, that particular seep has dried up. And within the same watershed, there's another site that is definitely going to provide enough water. So you request a scope of work modification to your project manager. The other one would be potentially you're doing a culvert replacement, and there's significant stream channel changes that now you potentially think a bridge would be a better component of the project. This all needs to be communicated with your project manager, and it needs to happen before any changes are made. So the questions that project manager are going to talk about, you can call them, or I prefer getting an email. We're going to ask what the change is and how is it different from the original scope of work, why it's necessary, if it's happening in the same watershed as the original proposal was reviewed, will the same objective be achieved, resulting in the same ecological outcomes? Does the change require an addendum to the landowner agreement, new, revised, or extended permits, budget amendments, or a revised budget? Do you need to revise the scope of work and or the metrics? And finally, can the work be done without a time extension, or will you need more time to complete the project? Some of the more complex changes to a project may require a site visit by the OWEB project manager and potentially even some of the technical experts from the OWEB review team prior to approval. Project modifications are not complete until your OWEB project manager approves and documents that approval. Remember that approval is not guaranteed. Without prior notification and approval documentation, changes can negatively impact your project and the ability to be reimbursed for expenses incurred. I can't say this enough. You need to communicate with your project manager at OWEB before things go sideways. Okay, now I'm going to hand it off to Katie for her discussion about time extensions. Oh, there. See when it goes sideways, your head plant.
Could I pause you guys for a second? There's a question from the audience. The audience member asks, OWEB has historically funded projects that are geared toward benefiting stream health and fish. How does OWEB evaluate or feel about non-fish projects that have different and or larger ecosystem benefits?
I can take that.
Yeah, you go ahead, Sue.
Well, in OWEB is ridgetop to ridgetop watershed. So we look at all projects. However, you have to show the ecological benefit, and they are impacted by if it's a recovery species, if it's a conservation strategy, if it's a water quality. By rule, our prioritization is guided with those types of caveats. But we fund a lot of upland projects because a watershed is from ridgetop to ridgetop, not all in stream. Katie, why don't you add to that?
Yes, exactly, Sue. And I think one of the important things to remember about OWEB is that we are still derived from this grassroots approach to determining priorities. And so we really look to the regions and the folks on the ground working and developing strategic action plans to tell us and to tell our review teams what the priorities are in the area. And we know that priorities can shift over time. And our process and our funding portfolio includes space for all types of projects that are within a watershed. And so funding priorities can vary from region to region. But yes, the audience member who asked the question is correct. You know, historically, OWEB has been thought of as a funder for fish projects. I mean, we were born out of the Oregon Plan for salmon and watersheds. But the way that we look at our funding approach is ridgetop to ridgetop, and we're seeing a great diversity in project types across all the regions. I hope that answered the question. Please contact Sue or I if you'd like to have a follow-up conversation about how funding priorities are determined and how ecological benefit is compared across project types. That can be a tricky and nuanced conversation among our review team members, but we tend to staff our review teams with technical experts who work in all types of areas in our watershed. So we'll have foresters and upland folks as well as in-stream and fish folks, and they can provide the necessary expertise to evaluate the project. Okay, so now back to our grant management process. Time extension. Now this is a really common tool that people use on OGMIS, and I just want to take a quick moment to sort of give a collective apology for the fact that OWEB is currently living with one foot in an analog world and one foot in a digital world of online tools. We are moving towards the goal of using more online processes, but we are kind of doing it one step at a time. And we have some things that are submitted in sort of analog PDF or email form, and we have other things that you can do on OGMIS. If you're interested in learning more about OGMIS, I'll direct you to our help video page on our website. We have 3 great videos about OGMIS basics. But one of the OGMIS functions that you will no doubt become familiar with at some time is a time extension. Now, when time is running out on a project, this is where you can come to request some more time. We just ask that you be realistic, and when you're thinking about your project originally, try and build enough time in. When Sue or I or your regional program representative contacts you before developing the grant agreement and wants to know if you expect any delays, it's okay to have a frank conversation. We manage a lot of these types of projects, and we know that sometimes it just takes more time to get this good work done. And I think for the most part, we're pretty understanding, and we'll do what we can to make sure we can still get that project All it asks for on OWEB is a justification, why it's necessary, and will anything change with the project. We really want to know, can you still get the work done? Is it still on track to be successful? And we might ask for some more info about a plan in which to do so. So again, talk with us. Don't wait until the very last minute. Sometimes there's quite a bit of like behind the scenes wheel turning that has to happen with regards to our funding to get an extension to go through. And extensions may not be possible. Your grant fund source does matter. And so the minute you think that things are going to go over, it's a really good idea to check in with us and see what the fund source looks like. Give us some lead time to try and figure out how to make things work. And again, avoid what we're calling frivolous requests. Don't just send a request in because, oh, gee, you'd sure like another month to get that final report in. Because those time extensions are noted in the risk assessments, and so it can kind of make your organization look poorly if you request too many time extensions. So really only request them when they're needed, and give us a heads up ahead of time. Well, now I'm taking it through to live long and prosper, wrapping up and monitoring a project. And this is where we're going to talk about reporting the final metric, project completion report, final fund request, photo point monitoring, and finally taking it on through and monitoring your project in the eons to come. Well, sometimes 5 years can feel like an eon, I know, but it provides some really good information. And first thing I'm going to talk about is reporting the end result. So we want to know, once you get into that transporter, what happened here. We just really want to know what happened. We don't want a whole lot of embellishments. We also don't really need an epic novel, but we do need you to record all the relevant information. This project completion report is what goes down in our record of what happened in the project, and it goes into our database, and it will be searchable for years to come from other folks who are interested in working in the area, who want to learn from what happened. And so we really want to make sure that we are accurate. Nothing punitive happens from being honest. So the PCR, as they are affectionately known, is another thing that you will submit on OWEB, and it's got these sections here that you'll need to fill out the information for. And again, we want you to be succinct and clear, but we really need you to answer every question. When you get to the lessons learned and the recommendations down at the bottom of the list, you know, I think most people could come up with something that will be good for posterity to note there. It's really helpful, and that's sometimes where the meat is of these reports, is what would you do different? Because that's the large number of folks who are accessing and reading these are people who have similar plans in mind. So we want you to tell us all the wonderful things your project did. Don't leave anything out, and you definitely want to explain any changes that happened. Changes can be, you submitted a time extension. If you submitted a time extension, you should talk about that and explain why. So we want to make sure that your project completion report kind of lines up with the application. So it's a good idea to check with your application before you submit your project completion report and refresh your memory about what you said was going to happen. And I just want to note that we understand that things don't always go perfectly to plan, and especially in this field. And so we're definitely understanding, but we don't want to see changes that might happen and not understand why. So in this case, what we have is the report. Can everyone still hear me? Because there was a weird message that came on from the call, from the audio webinar.
I can hear you now. I think someone accidentally double booked in our webinar system.
Okay.
But I think you can keep going.
Okay. I will carry forth now.
Yeah, we have about 10 to 15 minutes before we should start wrapping up.
Got it. Okay. I think that should be just fine.
Great, thank you.
So here we have somebody who's reported their final results. And what happened was perfectly understandable, as often happens. Looks like the utility board spent more money than expected. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service didn't end up coming to the party, but the Forest Service contributed some funds, and everything looks great. However, you've only got 58% of the budget, and so our fiscal staff and our reporting staff might kind of wonder what happened. The away team didn't come back. And so in this case, we've got 77% of the original budget expended because we consider our project holistically with all funding sources, but the grantee just didn't mention any changes in the final report. And they said no major changes were made. So in this case, we wonder kind of what happened in the interim. So make sure you account for what happened in your project completion report. If you're reporting changes or differences in funding like this, please let us know. So uploads. In your PCR, you'll be required to submit uploads. These are some of the uploads that you might choose to submit. You definitely want to include your final designs if it was a technical assistance grant or any technical memos. If it was a restoration project and you had as-built, stick those in your uploads as well. Also, any outreach materials that may have been developed would be really helpful to put in. So it seems like a lot, but again, it's the public record of your project, and it's really important to get everything down. So again, be honest, check your special conditions. There's a box that will ask you if your project had any special conditions. Lots of times people just check no, but then there were special conditions, and so it will be returned for revision. So make sure you know if you had any, and if you did have them, let us know how they were met. And again, you've got to upload your before and after photo points accordingly. Make sure that they're described about where they are and what they're taken. And we only accept JPEG files in OGMES, which can be annoying, but it's important, again, to have the photos in their before and after state up on our website for everyone to see. You can use Verify as a checklist as you're going through the PCR. You don't have to do Verify just at the end. You can always do Verify to see what you still have left to fill out. Once you've submitted your final completion report, you're going to want to get paid for everything. And just like first requests, these final requests require more documentation. So again, you just want to allow for some extra time to compile the materials. You'll need, again, the final expenditure tracking sheet, same as the first request. You'll want your match form for the final report. You can either submit your match form online in OGMES during project completion reporting. We do have a paper form that you'll see on our website, but largely it's just a lot easier to do it in OGMES, and most project managers prefer that at this point. So you'll want to have your PCR and photos done. If you had a federal fund source, you've got this annoying, funky sounding thing, the federal lobbying certificate, which needs to be just signed and uploaded online on OGMES. And you want to complete, just to backtrack, you can find your funding source on the first page of your grant agreement. So where it says fund source at the bottom, and then again, upload the form. And metrics and reporting. For metrics and reporting questions and forms, you'll have to go to our website to get the metrics forms for TA monitoring and stakeholder engagement grants. And for restoration and water acquisition, you'll have to fill out the Oregon Watershed Restoration Inventory, which is probably the subject of a whole nother webinar, and so I'm not going to go too far into that. When you're ready to close out your grant, you're going to submit your materials, uploading them to OGMES, or you can also just attach them directly with your final payment request. I want to mention that final reporting and financials are due 60 days after the grant end date, but once that end date happens, you cannot be reimbursed for any expenses. So even though the final reporting and financials aren't due for another 2 months after the end date, we can't pay for anything that happens during those 2 months. There's 2 parts to closing out the there's a little bit of a hurry at the end for these projects, but just remember to allow a little extra time, and if you can submit them early, that would be the best. And so now I'm going to turn it over to my trusty counterpart, Sue, who is going to finish our webinar by talking about photo points and ID mapping, and then she's going to talk a little bit about post-implementation status reporting after that. So take it away, Sue.
Thanks. As noted earlier, we got to have pre-project photo points for restoration grants at the time of first fund request. Why do we need photo points? Well, the old adage holds true that a photo is worth 1,000 words, and of course it has to be a good photo. Moreover, submitting early secures that photos are located in more than one place. Katie mentioned that earlier. And it also assures that photos are taken before work begins. In many situations, contractors hit the ground running, and that one item of getting pre-project photos may have been forgotten. Photos can powerfully tell the story if done right. When you're setting up a photo point, consider the time of day. Are there shadows? Is there glare? Think about the time of year that you're setting up the photo points. If you're doing a riparian planting, you really don't want to take a picture after you're done in the fall when there's no vegetation. Think about the green up. Think about if there's going to be 2 feet of snow over your diversion, you're not really going to be able to tell the story if it's covered up. And even if you have trouble accessing the project sites, a lot of times on cropping projects or ranching projects, their schedule may impact when you're able to get in there to do your monitoring. Orientation. What landmarks are available to help frame the photo in 2, 4, or more years into the future? And also, we talked a little bit about identifying photo points with the GPS. You might note how good your GPS is. Is it going to hone into 30 feet, 10 feet, 150 feet? Just be aware of that so when you go back to take photo points later, you're not completely off track. It'll help you get to the general area, but your landmarks will help you orientate what photos can be replicated. And captions, what are we looking at? Is this a north-facing juniper cut? Is this a spring development, a perch culvert? Make sure you include that information along with the GPS lat longs as well. So make sure the photo shows the issue on a pre-project photo. For instance, in a perch culvert, can you see the barrier or is it covered with vegetation? Did you clearly identify the photo both in the caption and the corresponding ID map? Note in the caption the time of day and the time of year the photo was taken. Here was a bridge that was installed on an important steelhead stream. Top photo is before, bottom is after 3 years. Are these good photo points or not? From my perspective, they could be better. Although they show the bridge in good form at completion, from the background it could be a completely different site from where the original culvert was located. Next slide. Riparian planting project. Again, the top is before, the bottom is after 5 years. This is a good example of citing the monitoring photo in exactly the same place. You can see that from the profile of the skyline and the fence line. Easy to see this is the same location as the first photo. And taking the photo during spring green up really helps to tell the story. Next slide. This is a juniper removal project. Even though the juniper is gone, the skyline profile is completely different. Is this the same project? Looks like the landscape on the after photo was also burned. Was that a part of the project components, or was this a result of a wildfire? These are just some things to consider as you're setting up your photo points. Creating a good map that clearly identifies where the photos are taken helps both grantee staff in the future, as well as helping me as your OWEB project manager key into where the photos were taken in comparison to the project components or objectives. The key things to include: locations of the photo points clearly marked and then matched with the caption number, roads and stream names, a north arrow, a legend, and a scale. So now we're going to shift over to the post-implementation status reporting. We commonly and fondly call this the PISR reporting. Post-implementation status reporting requires answers to the following 5 questions. Assessment of whether the project continues to meet goals. What were the original objectives? After a certain number of years, are these goals still met? If not, why? Or perhaps they've been exceeded. All information is good to include in your report. A description of maintenance or modifications. Has the landowner or public manager had to do any maintenance or modifications to the project? If so, describe what was done and why. An accounting of costs associated with maintenance and reporting. What cost did the landowner incur, and or what did it cost your organization to go and do the monitoring? Providing details so the story is fleshed out is a good idea. Public awareness since completion. Were there any tours on the project site? Did you show the project in any public presentations or displays? Were there newspaper articles written about the project, or was it featured in your website or your Facebook page? Those are the kind of things we want to know. Lessons learned. This is a good time to reflect on the project. What would you have done differently if you knew then what you know now about the outcome? Did it turn out just as you had hoped? If not, why? Photo points. Project managers from OWEB would love to see pre-project and completion photos alongside your monitoring photos. However, the requirement is to provide at a minimum photos at the time of completion alongside photos taken at the time of monitoring. Again, consider what best tells the story. Finally, check Exhibit B for any special conditions specifically related to your post-implementation status report. At this time, we're not in online PISR reporting, so you will need to send to your OWEB project manager one PDF that includes both the narrative questions answered and the photos. Be sure and label the file and the subject line of the email appropriately. Katie, if you could send in. What we like to see, and this is for all items sent to OWEB, have what the item is to begin with. In this case, it's your second post-implementation status report, the grant number, including the ID number, and then the date you sent it. Once approved, this documentation will be available on OGMAS under Images at the bottom of the grant detail. Okay, that's all for me.
Thanks, Sue. So that's the end of our presentation, and thank you for coming with us all the way through from the beginning of a project idea down to submitting that last monitoring report. And Sue and I know that that is a lot of information to digest. The webinar is recorded and will be available on the website, as Anna mentioned at the beginning. And in the meantime, I think after this, you'll be given a survey to fill out. And if you wouldn't mind, if you have any suggestions for other future webinars or places where you'd like to see OWEB staff dial down a bit more into components of our process, we'd really value that information. So thank you for coming on this journey. And I guess, Anna, can you let us know if there's any questions that cropped up in the last part of the discussion?
Yeah, I will double check. Sorry, this is only my second webinar that I've facilitated, so I'm still getting used to the question box, which needs to be expanded. And there are not any other questions. I don't see any hands raised. So thank you all for joining, and thank you, Katie and Sue, for that great presentation. I know you mentioned some other resources, and I'm going to ask you to share those links with me so I can also put those on the Conservation Partnership website under your presentation so everyone can see all those resources in one place. And again, our next webinar is next month on the 15th, and it will be on 401 water quality certifications, which is potentially something you might include in a grant budget if you're filling out that piece on fees and certifications and so forth. So thanks again, and I hope you all enjoy the rest of your day.
And thank you to our grantees for doing the good work of conservation on the ground. I know all of us at OWEB really appreciate the work you do and the partners that you bring to the table. So thanks again.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to close the webinar now. And I will see you all next month.